I will be covering the areas today of the reasonable accommodations. What are they? Who are they for? And how do we implement them? The influence on the student's disclosure of disability. How can we make sure that we're optimizing that? And maximizing success for disabled students. What are the roles for leadership, the inclusive approaches that have been mentioned, and aspects of inclusive approaches on teaching and learning? Obviously, that's quite a big agenda. I'm not going to be talking to you for 90 minutes, you'll be pleased to know. We will have a bit of Mentimeter work in a minute after I've given you a little bit of background, and then we're going to do some group work later on, and I'll be in a group session with one group of you, and my colleagues Alenka and Natasha will be as well. The UN Convention covers all aspects of life for disabled people. The Bologna process is a European Union process that's been going on for many years now, is entirely for higher education, and it's about developing inclusive approaches and practices in each EU country. And there are other technical helps, including the EU Web Accessibility Directive, which lays down guidance on accessible websites for universities and other education institutions. It's been implemented quite slowly, but is now more or less fully implemented. As a result of the work within the European Union, each European Union country has its own set of equality acts. Whilst they won't be identical in every country, they cover more or less the same areas of work. I work in Ireland as well as in the UK. The Irish acts are slightly different. The UK ones have one or two things the Irish don't, and vice versa. But it's broadly about non-discrimination, not discriminating against people on the grounds of their disability. And there are various aspects, particularly for education and especially for higher education, in terms of the way the education is delivered and what the expectations of a student with a disability might be. So I thought we might just look at the definition, because depending on one's own experience and background, our vision of someone with a disability will vary very much. The definition is very wide, and I think that's sometimes quite surprising for people, because the breadth of the definition will bring in students who you may in the past have been teaching without a particular suggestion that they have declared a disability or a disability exists. But as we've moved forward in understanding the legislation, understanding discrimination, we now have quite a broad base for the definition. So I'll just go through it. Persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments. So this is very wide. It would include a range of physical disabilities, mobility disabilities. Mental will include neurodiversity, dyslexia, ADHD, autistic spectrum. Intellectual, again, that covers the dyslexia spectrum in higher education, and sensory impairments on hearing and sight. And that these impairments interact with various barriers that may hinder their full and effective participation in society and on an equal basis with others. So that's quite a big challenge, I think, and but also gives us a good bedrock of knowing what we're doing. Who are these students? Are we identifying them? Are we clear about our rights and obligations and their understanding of those? Okay, moving on to the next slide. So how does this affect us in the university sector? And we have been changing as time goes on. Every year there's a little more changes. Every year there's a little bit better understanding. There's been a lot of academic research, which we can tap into if we're not sure. But first of all, I think it's good to look at the disabled student's journey before they even get to you inside the lecture theatre. The student is coming broadly from school, although some will be mature students who've got a second chance, who perhaps when they were originally leaving school with a disability, they were discouraged from further education. But this really starts with what they know about what they're going to study, student information on entry. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. But how they respond and how you work together is very important, that there's mutual understanding on both sides. Part of the disabled student journey will include the disclosure of a disability. In many countries, a disclosure will then prompt a needs assessment, which is undertaken by an independent person. But that isn't always the case. That may be, and I think in Mariboru that will be, that the student discloses and options for reasonable adjustments are available. But it's really then down to the lecturer and the student. So we'll talk a bit about that relationship. And the widening access obviously has affected the delivery from the senior leadership. The policies, practices and procedures of your university will have been changed and updated. We're particularly interested in those on disability and diversity. And we want to know who does what, who's responsible for what, where do the responsibilities lie for providing the supports and ensuring they're there when the student turns up, and in the different aspects of the teaching. The different modules you're teaching will have different challenges for students with certain disabilities. So this is the widening access agenda, which has changed the teaching and learning landscape as time has gone by. And again, there's a lot of research, a lot of people have done academic research and looking at how this change might come about inside your university. Okay, we can go on to the next one. Some of the things that affect the student's relationship with you within the university, and how much they're prepared to talk about the disability that they have, are important to understand. There's, the he did it, she did it view that if the student doesn't disclose, how are we supposed to know? And the student saying, well, I don't know who to tell. I think language descriptors are a good way of ensuring that the student understands that that they are, a bona fide member of the student community. We prefer in Ireland and in the UK to use disabled student rather than special educational needs. My own view is that you should be able to leave the special educational needs label at the school gate when you leave school and move on, because you will be a disabled adult in society. And disabled people themselves really are the arbiters of how they like to be described. And in the UK, they have opted for disabled students. And so that's what all of us working in the area will use. What the students need to know is who's going to see the disclosure information, how many people are going to know. If it's a medical thing, they will want to perhaps ring fence who knows that information. And one of the helpfulness of having the needs assessment is that you as a lecturer will know what you need to do. You don't really need to know why. You don't need to know the ins and outs of how many doctors they've seen, or you need to know whether a neurodiversity assessment has taken place, and because that should include helpful information for teaching the student. But there is this issue about how much and who needs to know about the student. And I think the student then needs, if they're not going to have the needs assessment, if they're going to do it through looking at the university's available information on reasonable accommodations, a clear explanation on the course requirements. The student is coming with no real understanding of how the 3 years or 4 years is going to pan out in terms of the activities they're going to do. They're a bit excited, of course, because they've got a place and they're really happy. But they need to look through the course requirements with the accommodations that you may need in year 1, which may be a year of basic lectures and assignments, may be different in year 2, where you may be doing other kinds of modules. So it's really important that the student, when they're telling you about accommodations, has the whole picture of the years ahead. And really my advice is talk to the student. You really need to develop a relationship with the student whereby they understand that the accommodations are available, that you will implement them, but that you will also have times when you check back in with the student at the beginning of year 2. Check back in. Are all these the accommodations we're going to use this year? Did the accommodations we used last year work? Because it's only a reasonable accommodation if it works. Otherwise, the student is just juggling something else along with their study. In relation to the growing numbers of disabled students, which is as a result of the effects of the foundations that I explained and the legal supports, is that the growing numbers of students who either were already there, but you didn't regard them as disabled students, or who have had much better diagnosis of the reasons why they study in a different way. And that will include the neurodiverse students, dyslexia, dyscalculia, autistic spectrum, Asperger's, and there's a range, and those with mental health conditions that are long-term, and when they're studying, they will always be supported by some kind of medical input during their whole life and during their time at university. It's interesting to note, I used to work some years ago for the bipolar organisation, and the first recognised episodes of bipolar have been documented as between ages 18 and 25. This is exactly the time you're at university. So this is a difficult one. But obviously doing all these extra things stretches the resource. There's still only one of you as the lecturer on the programme. But there are ways that those resources can be maximised. And one of the things I want to do as we go through today is to talk about how we can maximise those resources. Yeah, sometimes it's about money, but sometimes it's about sharing experiences. And the universal teaching and learning concepts really help with that, because as you develop a more inclusive teaching and learning style, you have to make fewer individual accommodations for some students. So sharing your experiences. Otherwise, you have a one-off experience. You may have a student, you have done the accommodations, you've had that experience yourself. You may not have another student or a student in the same way for about 3 or 4 years. And the university hasn't captured your experience of doing that. So sharing those experiences either through working groups or however the university chooses to do it, collecting data, doing follow-up interviews with students on their experience, are all ways of gathering that experience before the student goes. Otherwise, you're constantly reinventing the wheel as students arrive. Good. Now, I don't know how we're doing for time, but what I thought it would be good at this point, because I'm speaking in English, you're working in English, it's not as easy, is to take a break with the Mentimeter. What I want to do with the Mentimeter questions is to develop a kind of word cloud. The first thing that comes into your head just to see what's on people's minds. So as I go through my talk, I can be sure to address those. And then to find out just a confidence question about, where are you at the moment in how much you know and understand. Throw it, use the code, use your mobile, throw it in, anything that comes into your head. Modifying materials, that's good. Yeah. Yeah, preparing and discussing complex tasks. Adapting assessment, interesting. And students' needs. Oh, here we go, lovely. Yeah, depression, mental health spectrum as well. But my biggest piece of advice would always be talk to the student. Make the student feel comfortable in talking to you about what they're doing and what the issues are. A lot of students will be reluctant to be seen as different, and that's very understandable, and they will only come forward for the accommodations and the disclosure if they feel comfortable in their relationship with you. And that's not just individual lecturers, but the staff across student support who are also in a more administrative role. Doing well. Okay, yeah. Evaluation of their progress, very important aspect of this, and feedback to students. And positive feedback in terms of where and what they can improve, and whether as I said, whether the reasonable accommodations are working, because nobody wants to continue to provide accommodations if the student says, actually, this is no help. What I really would like is that. You have a very good and comprehensive provision principles of accommodations available in the University of Mariboru. So we're really talking about how they come about for each student, what the experience of using and implementing them is. About inside the university, how clear are you where to go to find information on supporting a student? And there's just 3 ticks, and all of them are fine. You might be very clear, you might have an idea, but perhaps haven't had to do it yet, or be fairly clear, or you might be really a bit unsure about the process. And all would be perfectly fine things to feel. Oh, here they come. Oh, gosh, look at that. I'm down. Okay, there's another code. There's another code. 52476325. I'll give you a few minutes more. So looking good. Looks like most people have, yeah, I've got a pretty good idea, but, in practice, I might need a bit more information and support. Some people are really clear, which is great. And it's fine to be unsure. That's, why we're going on this journey together. So now we're going into the main part of the talk, where we're going to look at the reasonable adjustments, how we use them, what works best, and then we will have 25 minutes in the breakout rooms where I've created some questions to help get you started, but you're not expected to cover more than 2 of the questions, so don't worry about it. Okay, so we've started to think about some of these things. What we're going to talk about is what works, how do we do it, how do we monitor it, how do we prepare ourselves, because for most universities, until the final results of the leaving certificate or points or however your students are recruited, you don't actually know, what your student body looks like for your your subject area. So, as I was saying, we need to individually agree the discussion on the needs of the student, and we need to match it to the course requirements. So this is a conversation. You need to set up some time to do this with the student, to talk through the information and check that the students understood it in terms of the course requirements. A lot of universities or departments, faculties have a course handbook where the student receives it in advance so they can have a look, so they know what the assignments are going to be, where the assignments hit in the calendar, and what differences will be in the second year from the first year, so the student can look ahead and therefore plan ahead. And you too then look at the what the student has flagged up on their entry into the university in terms of reasonable accommodations that they will need in order to make a successful use of their study time and the learning and teaching that's going on. The reasonable accommodations need to reflect the range of disabilities that are eligible. So, as I said, the definition of disability is now very wide. So that means it's quite a wide range of reasonable accommodations. And your own University of Mariboru available provision is very comprehensive. It will meet most of these things. But the question is, how do you deliver it, implement it, and check back that it's working? So I've arbitrarily divided the reasonable accommodations into three areas. Technical supports, which are growing in terms of not only popularity, but also ease of availability. Human supports, the most expensive kind. And obviously, a lot of universities are trying to move towards more technical and less human supports. But that, again, depends on the range of disability. And what I've called procedural supports, which are really kind of policies within the universities that can support you as lecturers to know that there is, a basic policy that the university lays down on all of these aspects. But of course, for every student, it's going to be a mixture of all three. It's not nearly as discrete as I have suggested it is. And this is all underpinned by both you and the student having an understanding of equity and fairness. A lot of lecturers are worried about, is it fair for a student to have more of this or do less of that? And that's where I think we need to remember that this relates to equity. Equity, I have one professor who describes it as if we have a cake and we cut it all and we all receive the same size piece, that could be fair. But if one of us hasn't eaten for 24 hours and one of us has had breakfast, maybe one of us needs 2 slices and one of us doesn't. And this equitable approach to fairness in relation to the reasonable accommodations is what you need to think about. You are not being unfair to other students by providing reasonable accommodations to students with disclosed and reviewed disabilities. You are creating an opportunity for those students to have the same access to the teaching and learning in the university as the students who are able to do it on a day-to-day basis. So we are looking at bringing the disabled students' experience up to the same level. So there is no need to worry about, are you being fair to other students? Because if it's working well, the reasonable accommodations, it should be absolutely clear. Okay, so we'll have a look at the technical supports now. For technical supports, there is a range of technical supports. And it's very difficult to say this is right for this person, this is right for that person. But recording for personal use has become accepted across the higher education sector in Europe. Obviously, this can be done through a fairly cheap recording machine, or we've all had to change what we do for COVID. So I can see that this session is being recorded. which means the students can then have access again to part of the teaching materials. Most students are going to need a laptop, and I know there are not always funds for laptops, but I know that has ways of trying to get these when all else fails, because a lot of the reasonable accommodations in technical supports are going to be done through software. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about with the accessible software, there are a number of accessible software packages. A lot of these are probably not going to be available in Slovenian language. So there are a lot of around the world English-based accessible IT. So I think in terms of working with your students, you and your departments within the university, including the IT department, need to have a think about, are you using all the software accessible features of a standard product that you're using in the Slovenian language? Because under those legislative procedures that I described at the beginning, all the major software companies have introduced a number of built-in accessible uses of their software. You can change the color background. You can see on my slides I've used a rather pale cream. It's slightly better for people with certain kinds of eye problems. It doesn't glare quite so much as white and black. And there are other color combinations that are better for people either with sight impairment or particularly with dyslexia, who actually find different color combinations much easier to read. But all of these software products have an accessible background in them, but do we understand it? Do we know it? And this is when it comes to sharing information across the university. The student may not know it because they won't have had the chance to find out. But the university, somebody in the university knows how to access these things. How can we bring that together into a reasonable accommodation for that student? And these are all free. They are not add-ons. They're built into the Windows and other programs. But we really need to know about them. Now, I'm not an expert. Individually, you won't be experts. But there needs to be a way of tapping into those in the university who know this. And there are people, because there are people designing your websites. There are people looking at the publications that go onto your websites, and they all have this information, but we need to find a way of sharing it. The other thing is that there is a lot of free software around in the world. Some of it's very good. Again, probably in English, but it's worth exploring it. I'm sure somebody in the University of Mariboru wants to do a PhD in accessible software in Slovenian. I can just feel it coming. So we need to look at the resources we've got rather than think about having to buy more things. You probably run on an internal virtual learning environment. This is really easy for lecturers to put materials up for their tutor group to look at. Blackboard, Moodle, there are others, but this is a really easy way of a student accessing through their laptop information about assignments, dates when assignments are due, all sorts of helpful information can be on the VLE, and make the most of it is my advice. Captions to presentations, there is software that can do that. Again, you would need to explore this within the university. And the University Learning Centre library, all the facilities that it will offer, enlarging text, braille printing, language adjustments. I think the Learning Centre library is where probably through the VLE or through your own internal IT system, where the students sign in, and they probably these days put their assignments in for marking. The Learning Centre library part of that can be a huge resource And it may well be that there are people working in there that know these things, but there is, how do you know who to ask is part of this question that we're discussing today, isn't it? And knowing what's available and sharing what's available amongst the staff is really important. And I think that comes down through, again, the leadership line of faculties, senior staff, making sure that all of this has been covered for new lecturers or lecturers who are changing post and things like that. So the next one, it did arrive, by the way, in the end. The next one is called human supports. As I said, I really kind of chopped these up into these areas. They're not as discrete as they are. Human supports, note-taking, I think is an issue. A lot of technology has overtaken note-taking, but if it's not available in Slovenian, you may still need to think about note-taking as a human support. Sometimes this is done by other students or more senior students, either volunteering or occasionally, I don't know, being paid, maybe, I don't know, to take notes for a student in a class. The issue being that if the tutor is talking to you and you're using some kind of access technology, or you're using hearing aids, you're looking at a sign language interpreter, or you don't have captions on slides, that it's impossible to take notes as well. There just aren't enough hands and brain bits to take the notes as well. The notes are seriously important for doing your assignment. So you can, if the note-taking is difficult to provide, then making sure lots of extra information is on the VLE for that student, or the slides, or the materials that the tutor has used are on the VLE. Readers and scribes, a reader reads to the student, obviously. The scribe writes what the student dictates, but must not interfere with what the student says. Again, this was something that was used more in the past in English-speaking universities, because technology has overtaken it to a certain extent. However, recording of the class, recording of what the lecturer has said is helpful, and accessible materials, which I know you're going to talk about later, and I think Alenka is going to talk about. Accessible materials mean there is less need for a reader. A reader is an incredibly slow way of working. I mean, I have a number of blind friends who, when they were young, had readers, and they just said it's just so slow, you lose the will to live, because it's not it gives you access, that's true, but there are better ways now of getting access. And a scribe, if you've got any kind of dictating option on your software, which can be done in Slovenian, which is another reason for talking to your IT department, is that option available on the software we're using in the university, then the need for a scribe goes away. And as I said, human supports are expensive. We need to try and provide a variety. A cited guide for orientation on campus. This comes back to kind of the work about what happens when a student arrives. What information do they have? They may well, if they have a sight impairment, need to have a sighted guide just to get themselves familiar with the campus. And that needs to be related to the department, the faculty that they're going to be working in, the laboratories, whatever, that course is going to use. So it isn't just about where's the canteen and the loo. It's also about, well, for this session, I'm going to be in a different place. Sign language interpreters, very important, very expensive. And I suppose when we come back to talk about inclusive teaching and learning, we're trying to say that if we can adapt our teaching and learning styles and make them more accessible and more inclusive, we can save our precious money for those who are going to need a more expensive accessibility. Dyslexia support. There's a massive amount of information these days about dyslexia and the way students work. There are a number of ways of providing the dyslexia support. The most common in the UK and Ireland is a support tutor who the student sees once a week, maybe for extra support in using the materials and preparing for their assignment. And this could well be somebody who's based in the library learning support area that we discussed before. And that way, one member of staff can support a lot of students. Personal assistants, people tend to forget about this, but in some practical tutorials with some disabilities, it's perfectly legitimate to have a personal assistant who does the practical work under the instruction of the student, particularly in laboratories where people with shaky hands, cerebral palsy, other things, can't actually physically accurately do the lab work, but they have their job, and the course is about them understanding and demonstrating that they understand what the lab work is about. Very small number of students need it, but it's a very useful thing where most of the work is done in the classroom, but some of it is a practical tutorial. So it's a quick run round. I've probably forgotten some, but I'm sure you'll raise them when we do the discussion groups. The next one is procedural adjustments. This is for really making sure that a top-down approach, the senior management approach, is there. So you feel within the faculty that you personally, when you're doing the lecturing, are supported. So statements within the faculty that these are all things that have been agreed. Now, with the student, having had your discussion with them and sorted out the accommodations, it's good to document this into a personal support plan. And because a number of tutors will be teaching one student, it's very helpful that all those tutors have the personal support plan. So it doesn't come as a surprise when a student turns up and says, oh no, I need to do it this way. And then you think, well, nobody told me. These things happen all the time. It's human nature. But if there's a documented personal support plan and there's an accessible way of anyone who's teaching that student of accessing it, obviously the student will have it. But if you just rely on the student to bring it with them, you probably will get it late, and the students maybe a bit concerned about raising the subject, that you might think they're a weak student if they need a support plan. Students worry about how they are perceived if they've declared a disability, that they're somehow less able, which of course we know is not true. An agreed baseline provision. So of all the things in your supports that you have agreed are available, a good demonstrable baseline that senior management have agreed and sits somewhere in the university information. It's just a statement that we are all committed to doing this. It just gives you that little bit of backup. There are a number of things that will be very common, have been used for a long time now. Extra time in exams, using the laptops in exams. These are very common. Separate invigilation for some students, particularly those with neurodiversity issues, students who need to sit on their own, students who need an interpreter for part of the whatever assessment they're doing. This is always something that needs to be planned ahead, because you need a separate room. That means you need to talk to whoever's in accommodation to find them, to get them to allocate you a room. And that's why I emphasize the agreed baseline provision with senior management, because all these people need to know, yes, you do have to do this. It is something that has been agreed. Provision of adjustments to assessment. there are, again, just needing to know that it's okay. You can change your assessment, you can change your format of delivering your teaching and learning. When I come on to the learning and teaching on the next page, we'll talk about that a bit more. But again, that needs to appear in the baseline. It is expected that you will, of your own judgment, be able to adjust the assessment or provide the alternative format or ask someone to give you the information to do that. Accessible study materials, we've really covered that under the technical and human, but procedurally, again, the whole university needs to know that this is standard practice. The library, the learning centre, the administration team, the registration team when a student comes. The student may need an accessible registration document of some kind, and that might be in large print or digitally received in an email. But the agreed baseline is that all these things are going to be standard practice. They're not an add-on, they're not a favour to a particular student, they are what we do as the University of Mariboru. And that applies to the pre-enrolment student information, the course handbooks, which we talked about. So moving on to the teaching and learning and teaching and assessment, because this is the bit that I think probably we went to the unsure block, that you may be the most unsure about. And again, one of the things that makes you less unsure is the engagement with senior management. And that senior management is acknowledging the student population is changing. It changes all the time. It changes through all kinds of diversity, more women than men, different languages. The student may speak several languages, especially in Eastern Europe. There may be many languages spoken, and all sorts of personal challenges in terms of living accommodation, whether the students had to move to undertake their studies. So the students are different. They're not going to be as, I was going to say sorted, organised. They're not going to come from an area where they've been through school, they've done well, they're going to university, their trajectory is clear. They will have had all sorts of things interfering with that learning journey. Now, I talked a bit about changing the assessments and what you can do. The thing that needs to be stated in your course outline, and preferably in your course handbook, is the learning outcomes the student has to meet. Now, you all know what these are because you set them. And when you designed the course, you set these are the learning outcomes. A student has to achieve all of these before they can progress. Absolutely right. And we are not looking to change those. What we are looking to do for the variety of students and the variety of disability that they have is the method that you assess those learning outcomes. You can make a reasonable accommodation to the method of assessment. And the learning outcome, that method of assessment will lead to the learning outcomes being met, but maybe not in the traditional way that you're used to doing it. But these are the competence standards. Mostly in HEI, the competence standards are called learning outcomes. Now, the flexible assessment options are part of the inclusive teaching and learning package. Not all exams have their place, but there will be other ways of testing knowledge. You can use presentations. Students can present to you or even to the class the information, the assignment that they've done. They can make a video. Some students who stammer or have other issues with speech would rather record a video where they can actually relax and do it rather than stand up in front of everybody and feel very exposed. Reflective diaries. I think the reflective aspect of what the student is studying creates for you a better achievement in the learning outcome, because they've had to look in the round at the work they're doing, and then they can present those. Instead of an essay, a reflective diary covers the same material, but it's a different creative writing approach. And some students may find that easier to undertake, not easier in terms of that the work is easier, but in the way they present their work. Now, a lot of things have been done because of our horrible COVID experience. And an awful lot of people, I'm working in Ireland at the moment, as was said in the introduction, a great many people and articles that I've had for the Ahead Journal, which I would highly recommend you read, are about how the things they've had to do with COVID could actually have some transferable skills in them to everyday teaching and learning. That actually they've been surprised at the way students have adapted, or surprised at the way they themselves have adapted to the COVID experience and the need to do long distance teaching, and the way that the assignments have reappeared from the students. So I would suggest across the university, have a look at what did you learn. I mean, we're not out of this experience yet, we're certainly not in the UK. What did you learn from this? What can we put into our teaching and learning groups of feedback that that we have from ourselves and from our students? And this is the universal design for learning message, really. It's about flexible options that are available to all students. This overcomes a lot of problems, overcomes some of the need to make lots of individual adjustments to your teaching because all the students are able to do the flexible working. It means that you can save your time and money for those who really need the most expensive accommodations. But it also means that you are not in any way watering down your learning outcomes and your standards. You're adapting through the different methods of teaching and learning to give flexible options for the students. And the flexible options, if they're available to everybody, are therefore something that will be built into your teaching and learning program. And you won't suddenly find a student turning up who didn't disclose, but who then has problems. You've then got to go through all the routine of assessing the needs, what are the accommodations going to be, because you will be able to put that student and say, look, you can do it this way, you can do it that way. And this is the universal design program. It's very well researched, particularly by the CAST program in the United States, but there's a lot of work. The Ahead Journal that I edit is available to you. It's free, it's in English, and you can go on the Ahead website, which is just ahead.ie/journal if you want to be specific, and there's a search button, so you can look for articles just on certain aspects. And Ahead is an NGO that just deals with disabled students in Ireland, so you will find a lot there from lecturers on what they've tried and what happened in COVID as well. So I would recommend it. The other thing is that you do need to constantly get this feedback from students. Is it working? You can probably tell from the quality of what you're getting back from the students, but if you're not getting good quality and you feel that the student is more able than they're showing you, go back, check again the accommodations, talk to the student. It may be that something different works better, and that you need feedback from the student. You need feedback at the end of a module or at the end of an academic year from that student, so that you can prepare for the next module and the student can prepare for the next module and the next semester. So I think that I have probably said enough, and before you think, oh dear, where are we going? Well, let's do some small group work together. The idea of the small group work is that you share your experiences with each other, that you talk about what's bothered you, what's worked, but at each group, and there are going to be 3 groups, have a discussion question. I've actually done 5 questions, which is kind of an odd number, isn't it? But we only expect each group to undertake 2 in 25 minutes because some may be more gripping than others. So we're going to start off with 3 groups. The discussion questions will appear shortly. And each group will be assigned 1 question. And then your second question, you'll have free choice of the 5 that you want to talk about. Or actually, you might talk about something else, which is fine too. The questions are to help you stimulate your discussion.